On the 16th of October, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution inside of Paris, the distraught and devastated former Queen of France was dragged to the guillotine for her execution. It was in this exact location that her husband, King Louis XVI, had also been executed just months before, and the same blade was used for both of their executions. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were seen as very out of touch to the needs of the French people. But despite the brutal revolution breaking out, no one would have ever imagined that the king and queen would be executed by their own people. After their executions, the pair were both buried inside the Madeleine Cemetery nearby, in rather quickly dug graves, and later their remains would be exhumed and moved elsewhere. There was less of the king to find than the queen, as some hair remained on her skull, and also her stockings that had been forced to wear were discovered in the grave. Today there is a chapel constructed over where the king and queen had been buried after they had been guillotined, and the expiatory chapel is dedicated to them. But in recent years, shockingly, the remains of many other victims of the guillotine have been found in and around this memorial chapel, and especially in the walls of the chapel. But what happened with this shocking discovery? The expiatory chapel was designed in 1816 and was constructed on the grounds of the former Madeleine Cemetery, and specifically where the king and queen had been buried. A huge amount of money was spent building the chapel, and it was built as a place to consecrate the mortal remains of the executed king and queen, and some claimed that this would one day be the final resting place of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, close to where they were buried to begin with. But the Madeleine Cemetery, where this was built, was one of the 4 cemeteries inside of Paris, used to dispose of the corpses and remains of those who were executed during the French Revolution. It had been used for some time as a burial site, and it was closed in the March of 1794, and was said to have been too full with the aftermath of the Reign of Terror. Now, after the executions took place nearby, the remains would be brought to the cemetery, where a team of gravediggers worked quickly to dispose of the dead. Usually, inside of the graves, a layer of quicklime was also thrown inside of the grave to help speed up the decomposition of the body and to erase the remains of those executed from the face of the earth. When the king and queen's remains were found, the quicklime worked well for Louis's body, as there was little left of his remains compared to Marie's, and the quicklime had not worked and had solidified around the coffin, protecting the remains of her. It was here where many other victims of the terror and the revolution were buried. But shockingly, in 2020, a discovery was made inside of the expiatory chapel, and the remains of many people were discovered inside of the walls. It was claimed that the chapel's administrator turned historical detective after he noticed curious anomalies in the walls between the columns of the lower chapel. Anxious not to damage the building's foundations, the French authorities called in an archaeologist who inserted a camera through the stones in the walls. In his report, archaeologist Philippe Charlier confirmed Penaud de Stout's hypothesis. The lower chapel contains 4 ossuaries made of wooden boxes, probably stretched out with leather filled with human bones, he wrote. There is earth mixed with fragment of bones. What this means was that the chapel had a number of ossuaries inside of the walls containing wooden boxes containing the bones of many people, presumably who had been buried there. The Madeleine Cemetery, where this was built onto, had been used for many decades, and it closed as residents complained about the smell and the stench of the bodies inside of the graveyard. But as the revolution picked up a swift pace, the amount of burials in the Madeleine Cemetery increased, and the burial ground could not cope. It was, for those inside of Paris, a convenient place to bury those who were executed at the Place de la Révolution, as it was only a 10-minute walk, and the remains could be swiftly taken from the guillotine to the burial site where gravediggers worked. It was also surrounded by a wall, meaning that the disposal of the bodies could be done away from the eyes of the public and could be done more privately. There were many buried here, including Madame de Barry, mistress to the king, and over 600 Swiss Guard soldiers who were killed defending the royal family in the Tuileries Palace during the insurrection in the August of 1792. There were also more than 1,000 prisoners buried here in the September massacre, as well as Marie Antoinette's closest friend, Princess de Lamballe, and many other, including Charlotte Corday. It became a place where it was associated with the deaths of those who were monarchists or against the revolution. But who did the bones inside of the chapel belong to? It's likely that it was the remains of those mentioned earlier, and those who had been buried and then dug up in the region when the construction of the chapel took place. Foundations were probably dug, and if the builders came across the bones, then they probably removed these and placed them in boxes ready to be buried elsewhere. However, there was a problem, as the Madeleine Cemetery was actually fully cleared in 1844. All of the remaining bones inside of the grounds were moved to the West Ossuary, but then, after this closed, they were then moved to the catacombs of Paris. It's not known for sure who the bones inside of the chapel wall belong to. They may in fact be the bones of high-ranking members of the French aristocracy or nobility who were saved for some reason, or they may have belonged to the soldiers who defended the royal family a number of times. They could also have belonged to people who were buried before the revolution. But what is fascinating is that these bones were rescued for some reason, and they were specifically interred inside of the walls. This was no mistake, and it was done for a reason, so maybe these bones are of someone noble. There is simply no way of telling without ordering excavation work inside of the chapel, and then they could be dated and the bones could be subjected to thorough investigations, but they would still not, of course, offer a definitive answer as to who they belonged to. When the chapel was created, Louis XVIII ordered that no earth saturated with victims of the revolution be moved from the place for the building of the chapel, but it's likely that these bones were those who were exhumed during the building place. The remains would have been taken out of the ground to then be buried elsewhere, but these could have been the people who were buried next to or close to the remains of the executed King and Queen of France. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.